Well, hello there, and welcome to A Film a Day with me, Jordan Woodley. And we are back, another MCU rewatch. We are properly into Phase 3 now with 2017's Doctor Strange. And it's interesting sort of looking at Phase 2 and the discussions about what the issues and the vision of Phase 2 is, because now that we've reached Phase 3 and sort of what I think was going on at this point is that this is, I suppose, the phase of grand ambitions. You know, whereas Phase 2 was more of the sort of phase of experimentation, going, okay, now that we have this MCU, what can we push the sort of limits on? This is a case. This is the point at which they're like, we know the MCU is strong. You know, we've been making billion-dollar films now for some years. Let's go for the biggest scaled ambition that we can go for. So, of course, we had Civil War, which kicked off Phase 3, and being a Captain America film, it was a huge Avengers clashing film with all kinds of weird and wonderful demonstrations of powers and abilities and story. And as I mentioned in that video, there were issues because of the scale of it in terms of the plotting and the challenges that it had in trying to tell all of the story that it wanted to tell. And I think, on some level, Doctor Strange also is a victim of that same issue. Because Doctor Strange, it's a strange beast insofar as it doesn't... there are plotting issues. Now, I know it wasn't very popular at the time. I mean, it wasn't popular, it still made $1 billion, so of course it was popular, but it critically, people were very divided on it. That the casting of Benedict Cumberbatch was brilliant. It was genuine brilliance to take him, especially at his peak, you know, and establish him in the MCU. Again, he is a pillar that would allow us to continue the MCU going forward. As, you know, actors have prepared to step out, he was perfectly placed to step in to take the place of other prominent MCU characters. And introducing sort of magic and the structuring of magic was always going to be a bit of a challenge. And yet, what Scott Derrickson does is he builds such a remarkable visual world that in terms of the landscape and the style and the demonstration of magic is a very difficult thing even now to present in cinema. It's very hard to make magic have rules and to be able to follow fantastical ideals whilst still being in a real world. I mean, yes, Harry Potter seemed to manage that really well, but it is one of the few exceptions. Magic, it's okay if magic is one part of a bigger world, Lord of the Rings style, where you have a couple magical characters, but when the prominent aspect of the world is magic, and then on top of that it's set in modern day, you know, the world outside our window principle, it's very hard to then go, well, how can magic exist in the real, quote-unquote, world? And yet, the way it does it is interesting. It's such an interesting way to sort of use the fundamentals that people have pointed out are very Inception-like. The visual style, the way that we understand how everything is happening is absolutely inspired by Inception, and how Inception, the sort of the world building of Inception and how the dream world existed and how it functioned. And that works so well to create this layered sense of, okay, there's the real world, and then you have mirror dimensions, you have the dark dimension, and so that people don't necessarily see all the things that are going on. They see them in small parts, but they don't see the layers of magic happening in front of everyone at all times. And of course you have these brilliant things like buildings collapsing and being rebuilt. You have portals opening. It really does create a world on top of the Marvel Cinematic world that already exists, and it fits well. The problems, I think, I've sort of been pondering over on this viewing of the film why it doesn't entirely work and where the problem lies with it. And I think at its core, the issue is that it's so desperate to try and build a visual world and a visual pace and style to it that people will believe and understand, that it sacrifices the story and the fundamentals of story and pacing. And lots of people have different complaints about it. For instance, the Marvel or the MCU problem at this time is the constant tussle between serious dramatic moments and sort of acknowledging humour, particularly in this case with Doctor Strange and his cloak, and the fact that the cloak does a lot of the visual jokes and the gags, and does that thing that the MCU likes to do, which is to undercut overly dramatic or self-important moments with a bit of levity. Now, I don't hate it in this entirely, not as much as some critics do, but I appreciate that it is overused just that little bit, and it feels tone deaf. There are moments where, particularly say in a life or death fight, we'll then get a small scene where the cloak is messing around, almost to sort of tell the young audience that, oh, everything's fine, this is still, Marvel, it's still a comic book at its core, it's still silly. But then it also does it in moments where you want to feel that sense of importance and scale and dramatic beats, which again are undercut because they feel the need to inject a little bit of humour in it. Almost like it's made by people who feel just that little bit embarrassed that it's still a comic book. And I appreciate that, I understand that, but again, this is phase 3, and comic books are something, MCU is something that is loved by billions of people. The kind of situation where you'll get into a taxi and someone will say, oh, I saw the latest Marvel film, and it's not something to be embarrassed about. And yet, the filmmaking style suggests still just that little bit of embarrassment and using humour to cover it. The other issues, for me, and this, I've not read or seen this complaint made as much as I feel it in my heart, which is, I think, the pace of story and the scale of time in which this takes place are so condensed, and yet it completely undermines character and story that to me it doesn't make sense it could happen in a short period of time. It's never explicitly said, but obviously everyone points to the MCU Easter egg at the beginning of the film, where when Stephen Strange is judging what surgery he wants to do next and he's weighing them up, one of them is a clear reference to Rhodey's accident during Civil War, and of course the accident leads to his spinal injury. And it's not necessarily that, but it's strongly implied that it's that. And there are some other references to where we are in time. But for the film to make sense and to happen in the way that it happens, it can only have taken place over maybe a year or two from when Stevens had his accident, gone through the suffering, the surgeries, the giving all of his money to try and repair his hands, then ending up at Comitage, and then going through the training, becoming a sorcerer, and then having the big climax. To me, the only way it makes sense to me is if it happens more closely in line with Iron Man 1. Now, I've always felt that would be a much better place to put it. That, say, Stephen Strange has his car accident around the same time that Tony comes back from the desert. And then years pass where he's trying to fix his hands and nothing is working. And then he goes to Comitage. And then more years pass where he's training and becoming a sorcerer. So that by the time we get to the end of the film, it then lines up with the end, sometime after Civil War. So that at least, maybe not a decade has passed, but we've had a good stretch of years. Because it does things like it has characters say, when you first did this, or, oh, I haven't spoken to you in a long time, and characters treat it like that kind of stretch of time happens, and yet, if you try to condense it into where it lies in the Marvel timeline, it's such a short amount of time. And I know that seemingly only bothers me, and maybe a handful of other people, but I think that also affects things, the broader storytelling. I think it affects things like character relationships, character growth and arc, and it means certain things feel ill-paced, and even stepping outside of that one complaint, you have issues like the fact that you have, I mean, this cast is so well put together. It's so well put together to have, as I said, Benedict Cumberbatch, to have Benedict Wong, Tilda Swinton, Chiwetel Ejiofor. It's an amazing cast. It genuinely is at that point where, Marvel films are now only bringing in these top-tier actors. That doesn't mean they're long-standing top-tier actors. We'll get to someone like Tessa Thompson in Thor Ragnarok, who is amazing. But, it knows that it wants the highest quality actors to present the story. Unfortunately, it does mean with certain characters, you think, that almost feels a waste. Particularly Caecilius, played by Mads Mikkelsen, and the night nurse, whose character name I've forgotten, but she's played by Rachel McAdams, whose role, I mean, firstly focusing on Rachel McAdams, her role, of course, is sort of the ex-girlfriend and colleague and someone who was part of Stephen Strange's life before everything, so that he can sort of make recompense to her as she was someone he hurt in his past life. And it does seem a waste of Rachel McAdams. She has such a small role. Her time on screen, though well used, and she performs really well, and they seem to actually do have really good chemistry. It just seems there's something about it that seems wasteful to have such an A-class actor, and yet she only has so much screen time. And then similarly with Mads Mikkelsen. Now, I'm a huge Mads Mikkelsen fan. I genuinely think he is one of the great actors, particularly blockbuster actors of our time. I mean, notwithstanding the fact that I think in Hannibal, he is just phenomenal. Like, he is, him and Anthony Hopkins, he matches Anthony Hopkins in that quality. And yet, the Caecilius role is not, it is the main villain, and yet it is a very two-dimensional, bog-standard character. And perhaps bringing him in enhances that character work, and I do think he enhances the role, but you can tell he's pushing against a very limited character. That this is just a one-off villain. Yes, they introduced Dormammu in sort of the big climax, and he really is the more prominent Doctor Strange villain. And of course, Chiwetel Ejiofor will be the long-standing Doctor Strange adversary, though he's an ally in this film. But having Mads Mikkelsen be this sort of go-between, one-off villain, I don't know, it's almost as big a waste as Christopher Eccleston in Thor: The Dark World. Better than that, but still, I don't know, there's something about it that I feel lacks. So, with those things in mind, it's a shame, because I do think, I keep coming back to the visual landscape. It's amazing. The way it demonstrates its world is so cool, and it should be considered a great Marvel film. Not just a good one, but a great. This should be in the top tier. And yet it just falls at that. It's good. It's a good film, but it's not great. It's not one I think, oh, Doctor Strange, that's something I want to put on and enjoy. It's just good. And that's notwithstanding the fact that I think the actors who are going forward, the ones who have already been in, the upcoming films like Thor Ragnarok, like Infinity War, like Endgame, like Benedict Cumberbatch, Benedict Wong, Tilda Swinton, they are great, and they have embodied these characters so well. And of course, as I say, Chiwetel Ejiofor will come back as well. And I hope the script is just better, and there's something about it. And of course we have Sam Raimi taking over to do the sequel, and that will be interesting, and I hope it just enhances it, whatever the issues are. Because Doctor Strange, at his core, is a difficult character. He's not a particularly popular Marvel character. He's known, but he's not popular. And again, magic, even in comic books, even in Marvel comic books, I should say, is still something that I think people are a little squiffy about. And this film knew what to bring in from the comic books and yet give the story its own definition, its own identity. And so if it has the strength to do that, I think it's so close to being able to just complete the circuit and tell a great story. Anyway, thank you for joining me. If you like this video, hit the like button, comment below, and share the video because it's all helped me in the algorithm. Subscribe to the channel and hit that little bell to get notifications of when new videos are uploaded. Check out my back catalogue of over 150 films and follow me on Twitter at Jordan_Woodley, where I'm always tweeting about TV shows, films, and the new uploads once they have been released. Thank you for joining me. Take care.